As I was saying, the New South, as it's called after Reconstruction, is a little bit different than the South prior to the Civil War, although some things unfortunately remain the same, which was um, the subjugation of African Americans in the South. There was no longer slavery, but the Jim Crow laws that existed throughout the South meant that they were not equal in pretty much any way, in any avenue of life. And from the various segregated facilities to the methods of trying to suppress their votes. There was the voter intimidation that I talked about earlier, and then the other ways of denying the right to vote through methods such as a poll tax, which meant that you had to pay a fee in order to vote. This would remain in place all the way up until the 24th Amendment. Hopefully you remember that from civics, which was passed in the mid-1960s. So for 100 years, states could implement a poll tax as a method of keeping people from voting. A literacy test in which people had to prove they could read in order to vote, which disproportionately affected African Americans who had not been allowed to be educated and learn to read. Literacy tests remained in effect again until the mid-1960s with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I will post on Google Classroom an example of a literacy test, because it wasn't just a matter of reading a sentence or even a paragraph. Literacy tests were designed to fail. They were designed to be tricky. They asked questions. You had to interpret what you read, and if your interpretation did not match the interpretation of the person who is administering the test, then you failed. The questions were meant to trip you up. So I encourage you to take a look at the sample literacy test that I will post, because I can guarantee you wouldn't pass. If the person who is administering the test doesn't want you to pass, then you won't pass, because there's a lot of questions that are either impossible to truly understand what it is that they want, or could be interpreted in different ways, and they're pretty much guaranteed to fail. But again, the grandfather clause was there for the people who maybe couldn't pay the poll tax or couldn't pass the literacy test, but if their grandfather voted, then they could vote. And that's what the grandfather clause was for. It allowed the poor white people who couldn't read to still be able to vote because their grandfather had. And if you've ever heard the phrase being grandfathered in, which is a common phrase that's used a lot of times, sometimes it refers to being able to keep going to a school even though the districts have been changed or something like that. Sometimes it refers to a cell phone plan, that maybe the plan changes, but if you already had it, then you're grandfathered in. So that phrase refers back to the grandfather clause, which is that something may have changed. Like, for example, oh, here's a literacy test, but if you didn't have to pass it before, then you don't have to now. That's being grandfathered in. If your grandfather could vote, then you can still vote, even if you can't meet the new requirements. So that's where that phrase comes from, if you're ever wondering. All right. The Old South had slavery as a means to enforce the social hierarchy, the social dynamics. The New South maintained those social dynamics even without the system of slavery. They came up with new ways, whether it be the Jim Crow laws or through intimidation and terrorism against African Americans. Sharecropping, even though it was not technically slavery, it was essentially slavery in all reality, because it was impossible to really get out of, and it was just maintaining a system of perpetual debt, so that they were trapped in those conditions. And this picture here is a really famous picture, and it's there's a lot to it. I really encourage you to pause this and actually look at it. and see the different symbolism. You see an African American family here who maybe were slaves prior to this, but now under this new South, you've got the KKK and the White League, which was another white supremacist organization, holding the skull and crossbones over their head. You may see the fires here burning the schoolhouses. The book and the pen maybe being like out of reach, or that they can't actually get that education. The lynching that is taking place in the background there, and the words above them that says worse than slavery. Some people argue, I think this is a difficult argument to have. I mean, is something worse than actual ownership of human beings? It definitely was a very, very bad situation, even without the institution of slavery that was still going on. And some could argue that with the terrorism in place and so many other forms of subjugation, that it was just as bad, if not worse, than slavery. And we see up here the eagle and the phrase "the Union as it was." And in words here, it's really hard to see, but it says, again, this is a white man's government. And it says the lost cause, which is kind of referring to slavery there. But so socially speaking, things were still really bad. Racially speaking, particularly in this New South. The economy was becoming more diversified over time, meaning that they weren't just relying on cotton anymore. Some places, farms started producing things like soy or livestock or things like that as a tobacco. Some went back to tobacco, textile mills. And you could really look all over North Carolina and see this. Textile mills around the Gastonia area, around Charlotte. In the eastern part of the state, if you're ever like driving towards the coast, you'll see soy plants, a lot of soy plants, soybeans. The livestock farms like turkey farms and pig farms in like Johnston County. These are parts of the southern like economy that developed during Reconstruction, after Reconstruction, to kind of replace the dependence on cotton farming. So that is the end of Reconstruction. And what I want you to be thinking about, and is something that I'm going to ask you in the next assignment, is to think about whether Reconstruction was successful or not. Thinking about what it is that Reconstruction was supposed to do. It was supposed to bring the country back together. It was supposed to readmit Southern states. It was supposed to free African Americans and provide rights. It was supposed to improve the economy. Thinking about all those things, and then thinking about what happened over the course of Reconstruction, how successful do you think Reconstruction was at meeting a lot of those goals? So just be thinking about that. So thanks for listening.